Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this session. And those of you who have still not found your seats, if you please do so, we'll start now. My name is Gustav Lindström. I'm the head of the Emerging Security Challenges program at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And we have a very distinguished panel here that will be speaking about long-term cybersecurity trends. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the organizers, ORF of course, and their partners for all this work, for bringing us together. And we now look forward to a good discussion. As I mentioned, we have representatives here from government, from the private sector, and from academia, so we have a very good mix. Very important when you talk about these issues. I will not go into their bios because you will have those in your booklets. We need to use the time wisely, and you will also probably see their bios on the screen behind. And of course, we have a lot of different materials that we can talk about when we talk about the future long-term cybersecurity trends. I mean, if you think about it, there are at least three things that we need to keep in mind. The first one is that we know that there are certain developments ongoing. We know about these trends. These are the things about more digitization, more storage capacity for data. We have better computing power, so we can see this. We have a good indication of where things are going. We also have certain platforms. Number two, we have certain platforms that are evolving very quickly now. We already heard about some of them. We've heard about the Internet of Things, the Internet of Everything, and how that is exploding very quickly. We have talked about cloud computing. We have talked about big data. There has been mentions of blockchain technology. So we see that there are many things happening at this moment, and there will be interactions between these things. So we need to think carefully about some of the security implications. And finally, we also have the normal situations. We have certain cyber risks out there. These will continue. These will be evolving. And there are also things that come at any moment's time. And of course, one of the latest things that we are now looking at is the political doxing, where you have some kind of cyber element interfering with the political processes, and it is of course getting a lot of steam in advance of the US elections. So with this, just to set the scene, that we have lots of different issues to think about, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, who will be Jesse, who at University of Berkeley has been working on many different scenarios, who will be going through some of these and explaining to kind of set the scene a little bit about what to think about when we think about long-term cybersecurity trends. But also, just so you know, each speaker will have about 7 to 10 minutes, and then our aim is to take it back to you, to the audience. So we'll go straight to the Q&A to give you an opportunity to post your questions, to give your comments, and we think that it would be very valuable to have that dialogue with you. So with no further ado, Jesse, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just dive right in. Scenario planning is a method for thinking systematically about the future to avoid being surprised. And it had two founding fathers. One of them was a guy named Herman Kahn, who was a military strategist, worked at the Rand Corporation in the middle part of the 20th century. He wrote a book called Thinking the Unthinkable. And what he brought to scenario planning was the notion that narrative or storytelling was a critical part of helping people understand how the future could play out differently, and then to change strategy in order to prepare for it. He, you should also know, especially if you're a movie buff, was the real live person on whom the character Dr. Strangelove was based in the movie by Stanley Kubrick. So he focused on narrative. The second founding father was an economist who worked for Royal Dutch Shell by the name of Pierre Wack. And Pierre was kind of an interesting character. In a buttoned-up organization in the 1970s, he burned incense in his office, and he also came to India once a year to work with a guru because he believed that scenario planning required a change in mindset, that you had to think in a fundamentally different way about the future in order to be able to prepare for it. He helped Royal Dutch Shell to navigate both of the oil shocks in the 1970s, partly as a function of his ability, through a focus on mindset, to see how the world could play out in ways that were different than conventional views. Now, I don't have the time in the 7 minutes or so that remain to walk you through all 5 scenarios that my organization at UC Berkeley, the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, has prepared. But I do invite you to go to cltc.berkeley.edu to download the entire document, which is free and contains 5 incredibly provocative scenarios. What I would like to do, however, is provide you with 2 lessons from scenario planning, which I will illustrate with some quick scenarios, and then I will conclude with 1 provocation. Lesson number 1, you can't predict the future. Some of you may remember that in the early 2000s there was a SARS scare, especially in Asia, and then a lot of hand-wringing on the part of governments and corporations about avian flu. My organization in the early part of the 2000s worked with a large global logistics company to help them develop scenarios for planning for avian flu. They were in particular focused on how they could maintain operations in Western Europe in the event that avian flu hit and shut down global air transportation. Avian flu, of course, never hit, but what did hit in 2010 was the explosion of an Icelandic volcano whose name I will not try to pronounce for you. And it shut down air traffic in Western Europe as a result of the plume that came out of it. This company had not prepared for a volcano, it had prepared for avian flu, but nonetheless they were able to use that set of scenarios as a way of maintaining operations even though their competitors did not. So you cannot predict the future, but you can definitely prepare for it. Story number 2. Now, if you're going to prepare for the future, you need the right map. It's the second lesson. If you're going to prepare for the future, you need the right map. In 1510, there was a Castilian author by the name of García Rodríguez de Montalvo who published a romance novel in which he mentioned the island of California. And he talked about a leader on the island of California whose name was Queen Khalifa, which is where the term California, my home state, comes from. Khalifa is actually, they think, based on the feminine of caliph, or ruler. And so this notion of California as an island persisted throughout the 16th century. There were explorers like Hernan Cortés who read these books, went to the New World, and actually tried to figure out whether or not California was an island or not, and there was tremendous debate. By the time you get to the 17th century, you have Dutch map makers who are creating maps of California that show it as an island. Now, this was a big problem for explorers and missionaries who were going to California. They would land on the coast, dismantle their boats, and carry them across California, across the Central Valley, up across the mountains, because they assumed, based on the map, that there would be another waterway on the other side that they would be able to put their boats in. But of course, there was no other waterway. They had the wrong map. So the lesson here is, if you have the wrong map, you probably have the wrong mindset. And if you have the wrong mindset, you definitely have the wrong strategy. Let me then conclude with a reference to one of our scenarios. One of the principles of scenario planning is that you need to use the concept of outside-in thinking. You start with the forces that you can't control to understand how they may be shaping the environment in which you operate, and then you start to plan for managing or dealing with those forces. So let's take one that everyone is familiar with, climate change. In my home state of California, climate change is causing a persistent drought, where we have water rationing throughout the state. Now imagine, and here we get to the future, imagine a scenario in which our governor decides that the Internet of Things might actually be the best way in which, for a state that is the 8th largest economy in the world, to deal with water conservation. And that we use sensors and computers to instrument dams, rivers, sewers, residences, businesses, everything. Because what we really need to fundamentally understand, we develop what you might even call an Internet of Water, based on the Internet of Things. Now imagine we do that, and imagine that it's successful. How might that change the perception not only of Californians, but the rest of the world, of the government's capacity for engaging in large platform or infrastructure projects that are designed to achieve some kind of social good? How might that change public perception of sensors and large computer networks and platforms and their ability to collect massive amounts of information that may violate privacy in fundamental ways because they know exactly how much water you're consuming, but that because it achieves a public good, people are able to look the other way. So this is the beginning of one of the scenarios in which we explore how the Internet of Things, especially government-driven platforms, comes to dominate not just in the West, but even more so in Asia, where they're able to use these types of platforms to leapfrog the West for education, healthcare, military affairs, and transportation. And I will pause there. I want to give my colleagues on the panel an opportunity to give their comments, but let me just use that as a provocation to think about what that might mean for all of us.
Thank you very much, Jesse, and also thank you for giving us information on where to find these scenarios. And you've also raised some of the issues that we have to grapple with here, including indirectly now the machine-to-machine communications, which is also growing very quickly, which will have implications for security. So with this now, I think let's hear from Joanna, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the organizers for having me here today. It's a great pleasure and honor, not only to me personally, but to the Kościuszko Institute that I represent. So I would like to start by saying that it's really hard to overestimate the significance of the projects, reports like the one that we are discussing today. Needless to say that thinking about the future allow us to predict future challenges and allow us to prepare for them. But what I would like to underline in context of your report is something that I value the most. That means that this particular report looks at the cybersecurity from very different angles. So these are 5 scenarios that are using multidisciplinary tools, and it might be obvious to some of you, but for the organization that I represent, having this tool and being able to show to the decision makers and other stakeholders that cybersecurity is not only about IT, but it's much more, that it is a strategic challenge. This is a very useful tool that helps us to do our job. Having that said, and referring to these scenarios, I would like to underline the specific one, actually the one that you brought up, related to how you call it in the report, intentional IoT. And to be honest, when I read the scenario, I saw that the authors put particular emphasis on the privacy issues that might come from the even larger and more widespread usage of Internet of Things. But I would like to offer slightly different perspective. Of course, I truly agree that it's going to be a huge challenge. It is actually at the moment already. But many of you may know, I hold the position of the program director of European Cybersecurity Forum. And this is the conference that brings together people from European Union with the special focus on the people from CE region, that is Central and Eastern Europe. And actually the second edition of the conference just finished just 2 days ago, and I'm able to share with you some of the main conclusions coming from this event, which rely to the concept of Internet of Things. Because what I would like to emphasize that for some societies and for some decision makers, especially like those that are coming from, for example, from CE region, Internet of Things relates much to great extent to the national security. It will be about privacy issues, but it will be also about national security. So basically what I mean is that IoT has already changed the way the industry works. We've heard a lot about the 4th industrial revolution in the morning. We've heard that maybe we are going into the next phase of this process, and I agree, but what it means for the people, for the economies where industry and in particular industry 4.0 is playing increasingly important role, it means that our critical infrastructure will be more and more vulnerable to the cyber attacks. And this is the trend that is more and more important for the countries like, for example, Poland, or for the region where I come from, where the industry is getting into this transformation and the IoT is more and more widespread. So just to finish with some conclusions, I can see at least a few consequences of this process. One is that when in my opinion, multi-stakeholders will play an increasingly important role in the concept of ensuring national security. Because, as we all know, critical infrastructure operators who rely more and more on automated systems are private entities. They will have a crucial influence on how our national security will look like. The second conclusion is that non-state players will also play more and more important role, because it's gonna be easier and easier to cause severe effects on national security only by using digital tools. And the last conclusion, and it's gonna be related to the circumstances of European Union, what we observe and what I predict in the nearest future and in upcoming years is the fact that IoT will be strongly regulated by not only national entities but also international entities, like for example in our case the European Union. So these are just a few consequences that I predict for upcoming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for also taking a more in-depth look at this Internet of Things, and also for highlighting the vulnerabilities that we will see in the critical infrastructures of today and tomorrow. It's counterintuitive because with this development, many are arguing that the critical infrastructures of yesterday are much more secure than those of the future, unless we provide some of the security suites into all these systems. And this is something, of course, that policymakers already are aware of, but given the speed at which this is moving and the use of commercial off-the-shelf, for many of these infrastructures that we depend on, does pose some serious risks. So now let's hear a bit more from the government side. Maybe Alex, you can give us a bit of insights from there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gustav. And I'd just like to echo my colleagues' thanks to the organisers of this conference. I think it's been really good and really pleased to be here. We were charged as a panel with looking as far into the future as we possibly could. Well, I'm going to start by looking into next week, because this is actually, it's a well-timed event from a UK point of view, because next year sees the opening of our National Cybersecurity Centre. But this is really laying the groundwork for the future of how we want to do cybersecurity in the UK. And it's something of a transformational year for us. And I wanted to give a sense of what it is that we're trying to do differently from previously, and what are the reasons behind that, some of those changes in approach. Just by way of context, we work in our government, we work in 5-year planning cycles, which is not bad, actually, by the standards of governments, but it doesn't look that far ahead. We've just finished one 5-year cycle. We think we've made a lot of progress on cybersecurity, but frankly, if we think we have a lot further to go before we can characterize our collective efforts as a government as being in any way sufficient. So if we're focusing on trends, so in terms of the growing scale, complexity and agility of the threat, in terms of the increased availability of malware and hacking tools online, the commoditization of those tools, but I think particularly if you look at the evidence around the extent to which businesses in the UK and elsewhere are still being the victims of cyber attack, sometimes because they do not have very basic cyber hygiene in place. All of the data points to the fact that we have a lot more to do. We have not achieved systemic and lasting solutions. So we need to change our ways. So how are we going to do that? What's going to be new and different in the future? And I think what are the responsibilities of government in this space as well is something that we need to address. So I wanted to pick on 5 things really quickly that I hope are going to be a bit different about our approach. First, I think we need to be much more joined up in the way different bits of government approach this set of issues. So over the last few years in the UK, a number of cybersecurity organisations have grown up in response to the complexity and the diversity of the threat. They have been successful in their own right, but I think it's given rise to a couple of weaknesses. Firstly, it's very, very hard for organisations elsewhere in government, across the CNI, in businesses, to find the help and support they need from government. We have not been, if you like, navigable. It's not clear where to go to get the help that you need. But also, in terms of incidents, so we have had some experiences in the UK of significant cyber incidents where our combined response has been, well, suboptimal. Both from the perspective of the victim, but also, I think, critically in terms of the messaging that we, as a government, have been able to give publicly about the true consequences of an incident and about how consumers and the public should act in response to that to protect themselves better. So what we're doing is combining a number of government functions under one roof in a single organisation, in a single centre, whose job it will be to provide cybersecurity advice and support across sectors that need it, to manage nationally, to provide a single point of national coordination for major cyber incidents, and to set about in a more concerted way identifying risks in key sectors and building strategies for how we can mitigate those. Secondly, I think we need to be more open and accessible as a government. So as others have said in this conference, this is not just about national security. It's not even primarily about national security. This is about economic success. It's about helping businesses succeed in cyberspace. But if you come from my sort of background, a national security background, we are not used to providing helpful advice to small to medium-sized enterprises, to the public and to consumers. So there is now a big push for us to focus much more on how do we make advice and guidance more publicly available, more digestible, more meaningful to small companies and to individuals, not just big government departments and big operators in the CNI. Thirdly, I think we need to recognise and make the most of our convening power as a government. So our ability uniquely to encourage and promote and bring people together and encourage innovation and best practice and new ways of thinking. So just to illustrate that, we've got coming up here in Delhi in November, the UK-India Tech Summit, which I think will be a great opportunity for government and business to get in the same room and start to think through what our joint approaches need to be for collaboration against some of these emerging technologies that my fellow panelists have talked about, as well as other areas as well. It's not just about cybersecurity. Fourthly, getting to the end. Fourthly, I think we need to rethink our attitudes to the market. And I think we need to recognise the limits of the market in terms of cybersecurity. I would assert that if sharing knowledge of the threat or hyping up cybersecurity as it's been described was going to provoke better cybersecurity practices amongst businesses systemically. If market forces alone were going to make good cybersecurity practices a true market differentiator, I think it would have happened by now. And sometimes we use the term market failure to describe that, a situation where that has not really happened. If you look at the extent to which businesses are taking cybersecurity seriously. So we do not want to regulate necessarily across the board, but I think we do need to look hard about how can we better incentivize and how can we fill some of the gaps through government action that the market so far has failed to fill. This is what we mean. We sometimes talk about active cyber defense as a part of the UK's approach to cybersecurity. So this is about working with industry to take the sting out of some of the most commonly used attack vectors that we see in cyberspace. It's about helping consumers make better and more informed choices about how they can protect themselves. Then I think the final point I wanted to make about what we need to do differently, it's about being open and accountable. And again, I say this as a sort of a lifelong securocrat, but I can just about pronounce the words open and accountable, and transparent as well. I think we need to do much better at that. But part of that is about proving that the work we are doing is making a difference. So we have a new centre, we are spending taxpayers' money, we are putting all of these effort into new initiatives. How do we actually prove that that is systemically improving the cybersecurity health of a nation? And I think that's a challenge to all of us here as cybersecurity practitioners. You know, when and how do we see that upward trend, and how can we prove that what we're trying to do is really functioning? So I think that's it, but I'll look forward to some questions later on about some of those points.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, and also thank you for giving some insights as to what you're trying to do to address some of these issues, because oftentimes we only tend to focus on the bad things, on the threats and risks, and we neglect the space for solutions and what some good practices might be from different places. You also gave a nod to the fact that we shouldn't forget about what we're dealing with today, the malicious software that is more and more advanced and is combined in different ways. And there's a tendency sometimes for us maybe to look too far ahead into very obscure types of threats when we have already a lot of things on our plate to deal with. So now I'd like to give the floor to Ben, and we look forward to your intervention on what you think are some of the future issues that we need to think about as we move forward in the cybersecurity realm.
So just to start off with, when I was preparing my talking points for this presentation, I started off by reading Jesse's report, and it was very good, but slightly alarming. There's 5 scenarios. I read the first scenario and thought, that's quite depressing. And I thought, but the others are going to be happier. And then I went second, third, fourth, fifth, and at that point I was almost prepared to get my shotgun, my water purifier, run off to the hills of Montana or something like that. But it's a fantastic read, and I thoroughly recommend it to everybody. But based on that, one of the points, I work in primarily actually the private sector. I work for a consultancy, and most of our clients are corporate. We work with some government, some NGO, but the majority are corporate. But when I look at both corporate and government, what I see is the gap between the threat actors out there, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a moment, but the gap between the threat actors and the ability of these government and private sectors to mitigate those gaps, that gap is growing. I do not honestly feel that the private sector, especially in fact, is even staying up to pace with the nature of the threats out there. I hate to be alarmist, but I don't think, I mean, I'd be interested when we get to the talking points whether any of the panel disagree with me or any of the people out there. The speed of the internet is not the same as the speed of government. We talked yesterday, there was a panel talking about the speed of law enforcement. It's slow. And that's just, you know, part of the checks and balances of government procedures, but it is quite alarming from that perspective. But what the government is failing to do at the moment, I think, and Alex, it's interesting that you raised this. We both came to this conclusion, me from the private sector, you from the government, that the externalities of cybersecurity failing are not being adequately addressed at the moment by the market. So there's an interesting RAND report talking about the cost of cybersecurity breaches. And the initial conclusion of it is that it's not that high. It's less than sort of your standard fraud costs. This is the report, okay? So I'm not, and I'm going to come on to why I disagree with it in a moment. Firstly, the report fails to address the reputational cost because it says, well, we can't calculate it, so we're not going to put it in, which is methodologically interesting. The second point is that the report fails to address the external cost. So as an organization, you may face a loss of $1 million, but the cost to society more broadly is, you know, maybe $10 million for the purposes of the debate. And it's the job of government to force organizations or to address those externalities. But I don't think government is doing that at the moment. And I think governments in Asia are going to particularly struggle. This panel is meant to be discussing Asia, and I think there's a real struggle around that. I mean, you look out of the window in, not just in India, but in Singapore, in Jakarta, in Beijing, what do we see? Pollution. That is an externality which is manifest. You can physically see it. But governments are struggling with that. They're going to struggle with something which is not, you can't literally see in front of you. And I think that's a real challenge that they're going to have to get their heads around, people aren't thinking about yet. Part of this is because I think government and private sector still see cybersecurity as a tech problem. It is computers attacking computers. Therefore, we buy another box, and the problem is going to be solved. It doesn't work like that. It's a complete misallocation of resources. It's an inadequate way of addressing the problem. Still at this point, a lot of governments are not actually identifying what is the critical infrastructure around Asia, I don't think. I think they're just beginning that process as to what matters. So even talking about the Internet of Things, we're not even at we're not even at the stage in Asia for a lot of governments of addressing the Internet, just full stop. Yet, while this is happening, while this is going on, the size of the assets that are coming available is growing. So the Indian government is looking at putting its ID scheme online. Now, that is an increasingly attractive target to either a state or a criminal group or an activist group. You can imagine any of those threat actors would see that as increasingly attractive. So I worry to some extent whether the governments are, and I'm not picking on the Indian government particularly here, but just governments full stop, are particularly understanding that. Especially when you consider that the threat actors are increasing in capability. So we at Control Risks have identified now 57 governments with a cyber capability, cyber warfare capability. That's probably an underestimate because we do that off public open source. The activist groups, one of the panelists yesterday said, well, activists don't make the world, excuse me, and we don't think, but if you look at activist groups now, they're becoming increasingly professionalized, increasingly sophisticated. And then finally, you're looking at criminals, and the ability of criminals to cooperate in a transnational way is far greater than any government has. The motivations and their capabilities is far greater. So this blending, this increasing capability from the threat actors is, I think, moving ahead of that of governments and indeed business. So what is this going to lead to, finally? I think we'll be seeing kinetic attacks at some point. I think we will be seeing potentially attacks on the internet infrastructure itself. And I think possibly what conclusion does this lead us to? The question I would posit rather than answer today would be, are we reaching an inflection point where the amount of information that is being put out there is going to top out? Are we getting to a point where organizations are just going to go, well, the security implications of increasingly opening ourselves up are too great versus the commercial or economic benefits that we might get from it? I don't know whether we've reached that point. I don't know whether we will reach that point in the medium term, but it's worth putting out there.
Okay, thank you, Ben, and your intervention raises a lot of food for thought, and hopefully there will be lots of comments and questions coming up. I mean, the threat picture, you mentioned a few. There are many more, and hopefully you'll raise those up. I mean, the undersea cables are a known vulnerability, so there are many things. But just one point also to remember now in this panel is, this is on cybersecurity trends, so there is a bit of doom in the panel, of course, but we all here recognize that there are many positives with all these developments. We've heard many of these in the different panels, but we are specifically tasked to look at some of the perhaps more insidious things that might happen, and that's why maybe there's a little bit of this more pessimistic outlook. But I think everybody here is clearly convinced that the benefits are very, very large. One last point also, the breaches issue, very, very big and important issue. And of course, this affects the private sector greatly, but also government. And I think one thing that has not been mentioned yet here, there was a discussion about the different challenges and attacks, incidents that we have seen. Nobody mentioned the breach on the OPM, the US Office of Personnel and Management, where a vast amount of very sensitive information was compromised, and how that is now being combined with other breaches, including with the airline reservation systems, really indicates that this is something that is extremely difficult to quantify in terms of the costs, but in terms of the risks, it can be massive. So with this, I want to give now the floor to Ilyas, also maybe a bit from a private sector viewpoint, but please feel free to navigate this uncharted territory as you like.
Thank you, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today and speaking. Despite this, let's say, doom and gloom panel a little bit, you know, the internet is wonderful, use it. We all believe it's valuable, and it's a meaningful tool for progress. I represent the largest information security company in the world, Symantec. So being tasked to describe how the world may look like from a cybersecurity risks and challenges in 5 years from now is particularly challenging. Because you know what? 5 years from now, I'm not sure anybody really knows how it's going to look like from a technological standpoint and threat standpoint 5 years from now. So as long as we sort of like accept this challenge, I would argue, I would try to break the question down into three categories. First of all, what should we be expecting in the technological sense? And a lot of the keywords have been mentioned already, but I would actually argue first and foremost that we're at an intermediate stage right now. We're at the stage whereby we're moving from the existing technological paradigm of the PC, of the server, of the somewhat smart now mobile phone, to the new environment, whereby we're going to have, in the 5 years from now, the full realization of the Internet of Things, the IoT, the full realization of cloud. Big data doesn't mean just having a very big server with a huge hard disk and a lot of information inside. It actually means being able to correlate, being able to generate context that results into actionable decision making. So when we talk about big data and about the fact that we're going to get bloody many information, it's about not just collecting them and stockpiling as if we're piling, you know, bags of rice, but rather making sure that we can actually drill into them, generate knowledge, generate data. So I'm not going to go into the discussion about, let's say, how much the breaches cost or any of the sort. I'm happy to discuss the economics of cybersecurity if you like, but the reality is that there will not be such thing as a silver bullet from a security standpoint, and obviously whoever comes and tells you buy this box and you're protected is not telling you the truth. Cybersecurity is about people, process, and technology. We are going to see significant changes also in the way we do security. So we're going to see much more security moving on the cloud, as well as we're going to see the bad guys using dark clouds, if I can use that expression. We're going to see a huge data surface because all these devices, all these sensors, all these IoT are going to generate information. This generation of information will give us opportunity to launch new attacks and new attacks. So again, use of artificial intelligence, use of threat intelligence to understand the threat, and obviously we used to talk about how important the server is going to be. With all this IoT stuff, with all this intelligent machine, the ability of protecting the identity and the ability of protecting the endpoint is going to be absolutely critical. So we see a resurgence of the importance of the endpoint. We're going to see more attacks. We're going to see new attacks. We're going to see sort of like, we used to use the term mega breaches, and we're referring more than 10 million per pop, per incident. And now, I mean, 500, all the population of the European Union breach, or half the population of India breach, if you look at the recent one reported, maybe we need to change, maybe we need to start referring as super mega breaches. So this is something we need to be, let's say, realizing that this is going to be a continuing trend. If I look at it from a public policy standpoint, well, several people talked about how we see a market failure. As far as I'm concerned, whether we're seeing a market failure or not is starting to become really not the real question. And the reason why is because we see more and more resurgence of regulation on cyber. Why? Because if we agree that the digital economy is important, if we agree that the data is valuable, it's going to be regulated, point. That's what governments do from the beginning of time, okay? So as far as I'm concerned, emphasis on data, security as a baseline, and a number of efforts around, and that's what I believe the digital economy is going to be regulated by. Data protection, consumer legislation, cybercrime, critical infrastructure, and trade are going to be the 5 tentacles, if you like, that are going to capture and regulate one way or another the way the IT industry is operating. So in a way, the age of innocence, whereby internet is free, good for everyone, unregulated and all that, is more or less coming to an end. Skills and skills development is going to be equally extremely important, and especially in a region such as these. And also, let's not forget the fact that when it comes to cybercrime, when it comes to counterterrorism, when it comes to a lot of operations, we talk more and more about the follow the money principle. Well, guess what? We're going to see a lot more digitalization of money and use of digital money. We will see that for tax transparency purposes, but we will see that also because we will need to be following the information online. Last remarks. The last area that I'd like to draw your attention, and I think all the previous speakers somehow mentioned about it, but they didn't actually touch on it, cyber and geopolitics. Geopolitics and conflict. Ladies and gentlemen, cyber will be fully integrated into military doctrine. We see already widespread deployment of physical technologies that are in existing weapon systems that have cyber capabilities or have major elements that can be exploited by cyber. UAVs. Technology like Link 16 are used to have a plane functioning as a sensor. Modern fighter jets are running their operating system on languages like C++, which is the language used for Windows. F-35 talks about data fusion, talks about using fiber optics, is generating terabytes of data per flight. We have cybersecurity incidents attacking UAVs or fighter jets already from 2008. So this is not something futuristic, it's just that the more we're going to build weapons relying on commercial off-the-shelf software, and the more we're going to integrating cyber in those weapons, the more intrinsically cyber, because of the asymmetry of defense and offense, will become a vital military option. And obviously, the geopolitics and the global problems that we're facing. Somebody spoke about, the first speaker actually spoke about environmental hazards. I mean, aging population, the change in the trade flows, the resurgence of Asia, terrorism, immigration, protectionism. All these global issues will intrinsically involve cyber one way or another, either as a technology or as a threat or even as an economic leverage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ilyas, and also for painting that very broad picture. Now you've heard all kinds of things that can happen, but I do want to repeat just one thing that Ilyas said, which is essential, maybe a key message. When we talk about the solutions, not just the openness and the transparency, but the fact that this is about people, it's about processes and technology. So the tendency to just focus on the technological solutions is incomplete, and because of that, we must have a much more holistic approach. So we've come to the end of the interventions by our panelists, and rather than me trying to now sustain a bit of a discussion among the panelists, I would prefer to open it to you. This is a session that is very wide in the mandate. We talked about many different things. I'm sure that you must have some comments, you have maybe some reactions, or perhaps even your own thinking on some of the issues, in particular maybe if they apply to the region here. That would be very welcome. So please, if you follow the protocol, just simply go up to the microphone, introduce yourself, post your question rather than a comment, but if it's a comment, if it's just short, and then if you have a specific person that should answer, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kishore Kar, and I represent a company called CSI. We focus on cybersecurity. That's our business. I have one fundamental question. If you look at most of the applications today, if you want to use that, there's a terms and condition you have to agree to that. And if you read these terms and conditions, you sometimes wonder why do they need so much of information? And unless you agree to that, you cannot use that application. Not many people read that. And I think that's the biggest problem. Everybody knows why they are looking for that kind of an information. That's going to be misused at some stage. Even though they say that, no, we are securing it, we know there are so many breaches that are happening, even in countries who have the means to protect them through technologies and processes. So is there some regulation that's going to come to educate people or to ensure that anybody who is offering a free service or whatever kind of a service, they need to restrict themselves into the types of information they should be collecting, not beyond that? And it's open to anybody who's willing to respond to that.
So thank you for that question. I think there will be several respondents, but may I take maybe one or two more questions, because I think we'll have many. So please, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Asha Hemrajani. I'm on the board of directors for ICANN. So I wanted to actually ask about multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. Where internet governance is concerned, the jury's out. It's going to be multi-stakeholderism. But where cybersecurity governance is concerned, it's a different ballgame altogether. That battle is still being fought. So I'd like to hear Joanna and Alex's views on that, and anyone else who would like to chime in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll take two more questions. So the gentleman, and then please also madam. So please, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Anant. I work with Carnegie India on technology and public policy. And my query is to Mr. Elias. I would like to know about the implications of blockchain technology penetration on cybersecurity when you have a peer-to-peer authentication. How relevant is the current, architecture of cybersecurity on this new way of data management and transfer? Thanks.
Thank you. I wish to ask, I think the buzzword here is interoperability, and I wish to ask, are there the government's interoperability is how do you see interoperability between the governments, whether it's US, UK, or any other foreign governments, and Indian, of course. I think there's no Indian representative here, though. But I'm Sandhya Sharma from Samsung. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. Now I would invite the panel to, take a stab at any of the questions and comments. And maybe, is there somebody who really would like to begin? Or otherwise I would be systematic and maybe give it to Elias and do reverse order. Okay. Yes, is that okay? Yeah. So Elias, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was trying to type on all the questions. So let's begin with with a more technological one. So my thoughts on blockchain. Look, blockchain is in a way a particular use of cryptographic technology, okay? It's a particular implementation, which in many ways is something that some of us who are also in the identity and authentication management business have been doing or have been using as certification authority for a while. I said deliberately because I heard blockchain being mentioned a couple of times as blockchain it's going to come, the thing that's going to come and change everything. Blockchain is a great technology, but as I said before, is not a silver bullet. Also, don't forget that blockchain had incidents which resulted into compromises as well. So as far as we're concerned, blockchain is another arrow in your query. It's something that you need to be taking into account and building appropriately if blockchain is something that is relevant for what you do, is something that is relevant, let's say, for the way you generate materials, you generate documents, you generate data, as opposed to, for example, addressing issues like network perimeter, network defense, or endpoint defense. Blockchain is a solution, and not a perfect solution, for particular applications. The cybersecurity problem is much broader and bigger than that. So that's on the technical question. On the point about are there rules and regulations out there that determine how much information you're able to collect and limit the amount of personal data that you can collect? Well, guess what? I'm based in Brussels. We got GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation, replacing Directive 95/46. So the EU law, and one of the, let's say, most referred to, the EU privacy law is one of the most referred to international set of standards, if you like, legal standards around how you manage the complete life cycle of information. Capture, process, retain, delete. Obviously, that's a decision for a place like India if this is something that let's say, is a direction that you want to go and follow. Other countries have regimes similar to Europe. Other countries have different regimes than the European one. The other question was about multilateralism on cybersecurity. As far as I'm concerned, that's a particular difficult topic because very often, as we know, cybersecurity impinges upon national security. As a result of that, maybe some efforts can be done between interoperable governments, but I'm afraid that at one point, once we reach the national security perimeter, those efforts will become much more difficult to come to fruition. I guess last remark, I think it's very important that you talk about interoperability between governments, but I think it's also very important to talk about interoperability between government and industry and interoperability between other parts of the world, like civil society, for example. As far as I'm concerned, the cybersecurity problem is a common problem, and only through public-private partnerships, on top of everything else, we can achieve meaningful solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to address a couple of those points. The question about access to data is an interesting one, and I think again there is a role for government here because governments tend to intervene, or they should be intervening, where people are not necessarily aware of the risk. And there's two questions, underlying questions here. What is the risk of handing over all that data? Is that significant or not? And is the market, or are the current laws addressing that risk properly? So on the risk of handing over the data, I don't know whether we've got to a state whether we actually really understand the risk. And I'm saying it's not, we don't understand the risk and this is the problem. It's, we just don't understand the risk yet. We don't understand the social impact of losing control of that data and how it really matters. The second point, but I think it's probably something that people are not necessarily aware of. And there are different approaches to dealing with it. I think at some point governments will start taking a more assertive approach when or if the perceived risk actually grows. The second point is on blockchain. Just to kind of repeat or rephrase what I said before, this isn't a technical problem we're talking about here when we talk about cybersecurity. This is a people-based problem. And I don't, and as Ilyash has referred to, blockchain is a solution to one part of the problem. It's not a perfect solution, but just relying on these technical solutions without taking a holistic approach to the issue, I think is just going to get you deeper and deeper down a hole. The terms of the debate need to change. They need to become broader. And I think everybody on this panel is agreeing that, but I still think a lot of people out there, a lot of the stakeholders are not fully aware of that.
Yeah, so just on applications hoovering up loads of data and companies looking after your data or not. I mean, firstly, I would also point to GDPR as a big part of the future for us as well in terms of the regulatory space. But I think there's also a really interesting thing there about consumers, the extent to which consumers care about good cybersecurity practice on the part of companies that they are buying services from. And I think if we can do more to get consumers to care more, then that creates a commercial driver. And there have been some really interesting, bad cyber incidents in the UK where, it's caused people to leave. So, for example, a particularly well-known mobile service provider had a well-publicized breach. They lost a load of customers. I'm not saying that was a good thing. I don't want to go around thanking the victims of cyber attack for their contribution to society. But things like that start to change the mindset, and it starts to make for more demanding consumers, which is a big part of it. On cybersecurity governance, I'm not sure cybersecurity needs governance necessarily in that sense. I just think there needs to be more of it. I mean, there is something essential about the ability of countries to share best practice, to share data, to share what they're seeing in terms of threats, and to share best practice in terms of possible solutions. So we do need to make sure that there are the international forums to allow that, and they do exist, but I think there's a market for more. I'm not on the next question, I'm not an expert on blockchains at all. All I would say is that is one of the subjects that we're pointing one of our research efforts at, that we do in partnership with between government and academia and industry. That's quite high up the list of things that we care about. And then the last one on interoperability, I think my answer is yes. And that includes, the ability for our militaries in coalition formation to be able to interoperate and communicate securely as well. So yes, I mean, absolutely, that's something that we need to keep working on.
So I would like to underline that I believe that multi-stakeholder approach is the only way that actually we can take in order to face future challenges. And due to many reasons. One of that is that I simply believe that conventional, old-fashioned ways cannot work in digitalized world. Governments do not control everything anymore, so this purely top-down hierarchical approach is not going to work. So that's why I believe that business, but not only business, but also academia, R&D centers, NGOs, are extremely important element of the whole picture and landscape. And there is another reason for that, because what we observe and what I would like to underline is that the nature of conflicts itself is changing. We've heard a lot in the first session in the morning that we are observing hybrid conflicts as a something that defines the new ways how the states and other entities interact with each other. So I believe that in the essence of hybrid conflicts is that they are using various tools and they are engaging very different actors, very often proxy actors. And in order to combat these kinds of threats, we should use similar approach. That means we should use all the resources that we have in order to combat these kind of threats. So I believe that in order to do that, the government will have to and will be forced to cooperate with different actors.
I think a lot has already been said about these various questions, so I'll just I'll reframe it in a slightly different way. One thing that might be interesting to think about in the 4 minutes that we have remaining is what are the countervailing forces that will drive us to a world in which multilateral discussions and engagements are critical for global internet governance. Because today one might argue that we're actually already moving in a direction in which there's going to be a US internet with a few privacy protections, a Western European internet with modestly more privacy protections, a Chinese internet, a Russian internet, maybe others. I think the word that often gets used to describe this kind of the balkanization of the internet, that seems to be the conventional view, the official future of where we're going. So what could happen that would drive us in an opposite direction, where we could actually be having the different actors that I just mentioned would be incented to have a meaningful conversation about internet governance at a global scale in which there is a need to compromise on the way in which the internet operates and the way in which it is governed in a multilateral way. It is, if you read the scenarios that we produced, you will see that we have different points of view about how that could play out, and it is a critically important question.
Well, thank you for this, and you can't see this, but there's a screen in front of us here that says 2 minutes and 38 seconds left. So at this point, I will simply just have a couple of words for conclusion, a couple of messages. The first is hopefully you've had a chance now to get a pretty broad overview of the types of challenges that we are looking at when we think about cybersecurity further ahead. We've also spoken a little bit about some of the solutions that are available on the horizon, but clearly this is going to be a bit of an uphill battle because, as we all know here, we're extremely dependent on these systems. We are going to be even more dependent on them. There will be more interlinkages across these developments, so the risk for cascading and spiraling effects will be growing over time. So if we are aware of these things and we can think about them strategically, hopefully we can minimize these risks and at the same time take the most advantages that we can in the economic sphere while ensuring privacy, human rights, and things of that nature. And again, maybe a final message is that we are facing certain dilemmas where we have to balance across different things. We have mentioned many of them. You can read more about them. One publication that I think is very good at this is there's a framework manual that the Center of Excellence, Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn published. The editor, Alexander Klimberg, is sitting with us here in this room. It actually outlines these dilemmas very clearly, maybe something to look into. I just simply want to thank now the audience for your questions and comments, but especially our panelists who have been very brief. They could, as you could tell, really go much further in different directions here, but they were very good with the use of time. So a big thank you to you.